Okay. All right. The Rules Committee will come to order. So let me begin by saying I'm going to note that late last night, the attending physician updated its guidance to reflect the recent recommendations from the Centers for Disease Control. And I want to place Dr. Monahan's entire update into the record. And for the purposes of this meeting and pursuant to this new guidance, a well-fitted medical-grade filtration face mask is required for everyone in this committee room, except for members who are speaking under recognition. This is not a suggestion, it's a requirement. I say this obviously not to start this debate, but so we all can act accordingly to keep members, staff, and members of the media as safe as possible as this pandemic continues, and let's hope this is not going to be for very long. But in any event, now let us get to the business at hand. And I want to, at this time, I will entertain a motion from the distinguished gentleman from New York, Mr. Morelli.
Mr. Chairman, I move the committee provide for consideration of H.R. 4346 under a structured rule. The rule provides 1 hour of general debate equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Appropriations or their designees. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the bill. The rule provides that the amendment printed in Part A of the Rules Committee report shall be considered as adopted, and the bill as amended shall be considered as read. The rule waives all points of order against provisions in the bill as amended. The rule provides that the following debate, each further amendment printed in Part B of the report not earlier considered as part of the amendments en bloc pursuant to Section 3 shall be considered only in the order printed in the report, may be offered only by a member designated in the report, shall be considered as read, shall be debatable for the time specified in the report, equally divided and controlled by the proponent, and an opponent may be withdrawn by the proponent at any time before the question is put thereon, shall not be subject to amendment, shall not be subject to a demand for division of the question. The rule provides that at any time after debate, the chair of the Committee on Appropriations or her designee may offer amendments en bloc consisting of further amendments printed in Part B of the report not earlier disposed of. The amendments en bloc shall be considered as read, shall be debatable for 20 minutes, equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Appropriations or their designees, shall not be subject to amendment, shall not be subject to a demand for division of the question. The rule provides one motion to recommit. The rule provides for consideration of H.R. 4373, the Department of State, Foreign Operations and Related Programs Appropriations Act 2022 under a structured rule. The rule provides 1 hour of general debate equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Appropriations or their designees. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the bill. The rule provides that the amendment printed in Part C of the report shall be considered as adopted and the bill as amended shall be considered as read. The rule waives all points of order against provisions in the bill as amended. The rule provides that the following debate pursuant to Section 5, each further amendment printed in Part D of the report not earlier considered as part of the amendments en bloc pursuant to Section 7 shall be considered only in the order printed in the report, may be offered only by a member designated in the report, shall be considered as read, shall be debatable for the time specified in the report, equally divided and controlled by the proponent and an opponent, may be withdrawn by the proponent at any time before the question is put thereon, shall not be subject to amendment, and shall not be subject to a demand for division of the question. The rule provides that at any time after debate pursuant to Section 5, the chair of the Committee on Appropriations or her designee may offer amendments en bloc consisting of further amendments printed in Part D of the report not earlier disposed of. Amendments en bloc shall be considered as read, shall be debatable for 20 minutes, equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Appropriations or their designees, shall not be subject to amendment and shall not be subject to a demand for division of the question. The rule provides one motion to recommit. The rule further provides for consideration of H.R. 4505, the Commerce, Justice, Science, and Related Agencies Appropriations Act 2022, under a structured rule. The rule provides 1 hour of general debate equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Appropriations or their designees. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the bill. The rule provides that the amendment printed in Part E of the Rules Committee report shall be considered as adopted and the bill as amended shall be considered as read. The rule waives all points of order against provisions of the bill as amended. The rule provides that the following debate pursuant Section 9, each further amendment printed in Part F of the report not earlier considered as part of amendments en bloc pursuant to Section 11 shall be considered only in the order printed in the report, may be offered only by a member designated in the report, shall be considered as read, shall be debatable for the time specified in the report, equally divided and controlled by the proponent, and an opponent may be withdrawn by the proponent at any time before the question is put thereon, shall not be subject to amendment, and shall not be subject to a demand for division of the question. The rule provides that at any time after debate pursuant to Section 9, the chair of the Committee on Appropriations or her designee may offer amendments en bloc consisting of further amendments printed in Part F of the report not earlier disposed of. Amendments en bloc shall be considered as read, shall be debatable for 20 minutes, equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Appropriations or their designees, shall not be subject to amendment and shall not be subject to a demand for division of the question. The rule waives all points of order against the amendments printed in parts B, D, and F of the report or amendments en bloc described in sections 3, 7, and 11 of the resolution. Finally, the rule provides one motion to recommit.
You heard the motion from the gentleman from New York who read it flawlessly, I want to say. Is there any discussion on any amendments? Mr. Cole?
I'm just curious how long the gentleman practiced to read it.
Yeah, he,
Now, yes, I do have an amendment, Mr. Chairman. I would once again propose that we bring this to the floor under an open rule. That was traditional in the appropriations process. We've gotten away from that. I think that's a mistake by both parties, quite frankly. I think if we actually had open rules, and I would grant you, Mr. Chairman, probably it would be difficult in the initial efforts to do that. But we'd get back to where you actually get a product that, once it got across this floor, would have a chance of actually getting passed in the United States Senate, because it would become progressively more bipartisan. The other point I would make, and I made this earlier in a different amendment form, I will tell you, this idea of bundling bills as an appropriator is a huge mistake, because there are a lot of these bills. I can promise you, the agriculture bill would probably pass on its own. The interior bill would probably pass on its own. The ledge branch bill would probably pass on its own. I mean, with huge bipartisan majorities. And that wouldn't be true with some of the bigger bills where there's lots of contention. But we miss the chance to act bipartisan by grouping them in this way and by sharply limiting what members can do. And it becomes, I mean, right now, we're probably going to bring to the floor 3 bills that probably will not get a single Republican vote. We brought 7. I don't think they got a single Republican vote. And again, multiple of those bills could have gotten votes. A couple of these, at least one of these, could get votes, and substantial votes. So, you know, I don't expect to prevail today, but I'm going to keep putting it on the in front of the committee to think about, because I think you know, we've allowed ourselves on this committee and under both parties become the instrument of polarization in the House instead of the instrument of opening it up. And I know what you prefer to do. I don't mean on my motion. I mean, I've served with you long enough to know that you want to maximize the ability of individual members to be able to voice their views, achieve their objectives, and to find common ground between the parties. I've watched you do it on AUMF. I've watched you do it on hunger. I've watched you do it on a variety of topics that are important to you and important to the country. So anyway, it's offered in that spirit, and so I hope we have an open rule.
no, I appreciate it. And I just will point out that at least these 3 bills will be considered individually. So they're not, it's not one, you know, like the 7 that are going to be one minibus. These will be voted on individually. I'm not sure it's going to change the outcome of the vote on the floor.
Optimistic.
Right, but anyway, I just point that out. But I appreciate the gentleman. Any other discussion on the Cole Amendment? If not, the vote is on the Cole Amendment. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. No. Opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
Now we request a roll.
A roll call has been requested. Clerk will call the roll.
Mrs. Torres? No. Mrs. Torres? No. Mr. Perlmutter?
No.
Mr. Perlmutter? No. Mr. Raskin?
No.
Mr. Raskin? No. Ms. Scanlon? No. Ms. Scanlon? No. Mr. Morelli? No. Mr. Morelli? No. Mr. DeSaulnier?
No.
Mr. DeSaulnier? No. Ms. Ross? Mr. Neguse? Mr. Cole?
Aye.
Mr. Cole? Aye. Mr. Burgess? Mr. Reschenthaler? Mr. Reschenthaler? Aye. Mrs. Fishbach? Aye. Mrs. Fishbach? Aye. Mr. Chairman?
No.
Mr. Chairman? No.
Clerk, report the total.
3 yeas, 7 nays.
Members not agreed to further amendments. Mr. Cole.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment to move that the committee make an order amendment number 16, H.R. 4373, offered by Ms. Henson of Iowa. The amendment prevents taxpayer funding from going to foreign entities that support or perform forced abortions and involuntary sterilizations. I want to put this amendment in my discussion in the context of a larger issue, Mr. Chairman, that I think is going to make all these bills, frankly, in the end, unpassable in the United States Congress, not the House, and therefore will never become law. With all due respect to my friends, you've decided in this appropriation cycle, unlike the previous two when you were in the majority, to systematically strip every single pro-life provision that there is in any bill. Stop and think about this. This isn't an attack on one amendment. This is 12 bills. There's no traditional pro-life bipartisan defense. These were all bipartisan. They were passed. Most of them were passed in Democratic Congresses. Helms Amendment, which I think is the oldest, was passed in 1971, 50 years ago. You had pretty decisive majorities then. The Hyde Amendment, you had decisive majorities. So my friends have clearly changed their position over time. I would suggest your majorities have gotten a lot smaller because of that, but that's your choice. But these things have been in these bills for multiple decades, not years, decades, and you have voted for them over and over. And now to take them out with no consultation and no change of opinion in the other party means you are on a collision course with, certainly with us, but more importantly, you're on a chart where you cannot pass these bills. And I've said this before. There are people on my side that are thrilled that you've picked this fight, and that are thrilled that we may end up in a shutdown or a CR. But that's what these kind of decisions on your part mean. That's where we will go. As an appropriator, I've always said I don't like that. I mean, I think appropriations is a very practical business. It's about spending money just like a business, and that every year you need to make adjustments. What you need one year, you don't need the next. Something you didn't need, you do need. And I respect even when power changes. I'm not interested in passing Donald Trump's last negotiated budget for next year. That's 2 years away from when we thought that was the right thing to do collectively. There's a different power structure, so you guys should want something different. And even on our side, we want to see an increase in defense spending. There are things we agree with the president on, like NIH, CDC, strategic stockpile. Those are all things we worked on together in a bipartisan sense. We want to continue to work with the new administration on. And so there's lots of things we can do, and I just say this is appropriate. What we do is different than what authorizers do, because kind of like your family budget, usually changes are incremental and cumulative. You sort of set something out because the money doesn't change dramatically in a given year, and you usually can't change priorities 100%. So you sort of set a goal and start putting a little bit toward it, shrinking in some areas, growing in others. Sadly, but when we elevate these cultural issues and they get in the way, then the financial way that we ought to be working is what's ultimately at risk. So, again, I think this would be allowing the vote. I don't expect to win the vote if you allow the vote, but I think it's an important sign that we're going to at least hear the debate. Because right now, these weren't stripped out in committee on votes. They were just stripped out and laid out in front of us, and then we, in committee at least, had the opportunity, because we run a very open process in the Approach Committee, thanks to Ms. DeLauro, our Chairwoman DeLauro, we had an opportunity to vote. The House ought to get an opportunity to vote. This was a bipartisan provision that was passed 50 years ago, and now you're going to strip it out without a vote of the full House. You got the votes. You ought to be willing to vote on the amendment. So with that, I would press the amendment.
Thank you. You heard the Cole Amendment, any other discussion? If not, the vote is on the Cole Amendment. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. No. Be the chair, the noes have it.
I'd like a roll call, Mr. Chairman.
Roll call has been requested. Clerk will call the roll.
Mrs. Torres?
No.
Mrs. Torres? No. Mr. Perlmutter? Mr. Perlmutter? No. Mr. Raskin?
No.
Mr. Raskin? No. Ms. Scanlon? Ms. Scanlon? No. Mr. Morelli? No. Mr. Morelli? No. Mr. DeSaulnier?
No.
Mr. DeSaulnier? No. Ms. Ross? Mr. Neguse?
No.
Mr. Neguse? No. Mr. Cole?
Aye.
Mr. Cole? Aye. Mr. Burgess? Mr. Reschenthaler? Mr. Reschenthaler? Aye. Mrs. Fishbach? Aye. Mrs. Fishbach? Aye. Mr. Chairman?
No.
Mr. Chairman? No.
Clerk report the total.
3 yeas, 8 nays.
Amendment is not agreed to. Further amendments.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment to the rule. I move the committee make and order Amendment 67 to H.R. 4373 offered by Mr. Keller of Pennsylvania. This amendment suspends the president's waiver authority related to the Nord Stream 2 pipeline for fiscal year 2022 and each fiscal year thereafter. Mr. Chairman, the Biden administration's surrender on the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, despite historic bipartisan opposition, is nothing short of a gift to Russian President Vladimir Putin and other energy adversaries and competitors in Europe, such as Germany. This capitulation to the Putin regime came with nothing for America in return. It made the world less secure for our allies in regions like Poland and Ukraine, and it fails to foster transatlantic relationships as there remains opposition across Europe. Despite the fervent bipartisan opposition from both the Obama and Trump administration, it's upsetting to see the Biden administration now bowing down to Vladimir Putin. Ultimately, Congress needs to take a stand to help provide for stronger security and rebuild good standing in the region. And at the very least, the House could do this and debate such concerns on the floor. I urge adoption of my motion, and I yield back.
Heard the gentleman's amendment. Is further discussion? Mr. Cole.
Yeah, I don't usually engage in these, but this one I do want to say something about because energy is something that's important to my home state in Oklahoma. I have to tell you, Mr. Chairman, it's egregious to me to watch one of the first positions the Biden administration take is to cut off a pipeline from Canada, which is our friend, and which allows us, by the way, to run a pipeline across the length of their country from Alaska to ours. And all they asked was the privilege of doing the same thing so they could move their product out of port. And then, to do that for environmental or political purposes, because the oil is still going to come. It's just going to come in a less environmentally safe way on railroads and trucks. And then to turn around and facilitate a pipeline where the Russians are transmitting stuff in markets we could have. And by the way, without mentioning the countries, I've been to Europe quite a bit, talked to quite a few foreign countries about this. We had a lot of help in Europe that was on our side that thought Germany was making a bad mistake and that did not want this to happen. And they took risk in backing us up, not letting the pipeline move across their waters or their territories. We've got some frontline states like Ukraine that's going to clearly get sidelined by this, and frontline NATO states like Poland that are not happy about this. And it's just, it's unbelievable to me that we would do this. It's like an unforced error. So, and to enrich Putin in the process, unreal. So, again, I just support the gentleman's motion.
Heard the gentleman's amendment. The vote is on the Russian dollar amendment. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. No. Me, the chair, the noes have it. Roll call has been requested.
Mrs. Torres? No. Mrs. Torres? No. Mr. Perlmutter? Mr. Perlmutter? No. Mr. Raskin?
No.
Mr. Raskin? No. Ms. Scanlon? Ms. Scanlon? No. Mr. Morelli? Mr. Morelli? No. Mr. DeSaulnier?
No.
Mr. DeSaulnier? No. Ms. Ross?
No.
Ms. Ross? No. Mr. Neguse?
No.
Mr. Neguse? No. Mr. Cole?
Aye.
Mr. Cole? Aye. Mr. Burgess? Mr. Eschendaler? Mr. Eschendaler? Aye. Mrs. Fishbach? Aye. Mrs. Fishbach? Aye. Mr. Chairman?
No.
Mr. Chairman? No.
Clerk, report the total.
3 yeas, 9 nays.
Members not agreed to further amendments. No further amendments. The vote now is on the motion of the gentleman from New York, Mr. Morelli. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, no.
No.
Me, as chair, the ayes have it.
Now we'd like a roll call.
Roll call vote has been requested. Clerk will call the roll.
Mrs. Torres? Aye. Mrs. Torres? Aye. Mr. Perlmutter?
Aye.
Mr. Perlmutter? Aye. Mr. Raskin? Mr. Raskin?
Aye.
Mr. Raskin? Aye. Ms. Scanlon? Ms. Scanlon? Aye. Mr. Morelli? Mr. Morelli? Aye. Mr. DeSaulnier?
Aye.
Mr. DeSaulnier? Aye. Ms. Ross?
Aye.
Ms. Ross? Aye. Mr. Neguse?
Aye.
Mr. Neguse? Aye. Mr. Cole?
No.
Mr. Cole? No. Mr. Burgess? Mr. Eschendaler? Mr. Eschendaler? No. Mrs. Fishbach? No. Mrs. Fishbach? No. Mr. Chairman?
Aye.
Mr. Chairman? Aye.
Clerk, report the total.
9 yeas, 3 nays.
The motion is agreed to, and Mr. Morelli will carry it for the Democrats.
And Mr. Reschenthaler will carry it for the Republicans.
All right, thank you, everybody. What? Oh, yeah, we're going to be on the floor in a few minutes. So we're going to be on the, yeah, okay. All right, thank you, everybody. The Rules Committee is adjourned.